Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
So I would like to cover for you a hodgepodge of ideas, but it all goes around growing low input lawns. And again, I originally gave Natalie a really long title about blah, 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 and I put that talk together. And I did this one last night and said, well, that one went pretty well. And David Yost agreed. He goes, do that one again. I was like, all right, I'm going to do this again. And y'all can complain to me later on if you wish. But let's target growing low input lawns. And this is a slide showing 4 different levels of turfgrass management. And top left there, my world gets very busy every spring in April whenever Augusta hosts the Masters at Augusta National. And people call wanting to know, I want a lawn that looks like that. I want those azaleas and those dogwoods. And I'm like, yeah, doesn't everyone? And that's probably the most intensively managed piece of turf on the planet. Definitely for the final few months prior to this event. It's just every piece of pine straw needs to be in a certain place there in that rough. So again, that is an intensively managed turf, anything but low input. The opposite of that is a former neighbor's yard that I had in one of the several houses that I've lived in here in Blacksburg. And their idea of a great looking lawn was one that had quite a few dandelions in it. And dandelions do serve pollinators services, and the flower is actually quite attractive. But again, I tell people, you know, you see the logo up there, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The bottom left takes me back to the start of my career when I was at Mississippi State University. I was over in the Delta doing some athletic field visits and came across the entire lawn had been concreted. And a person was getting out of that car that's underneath the carport there. And I said, hey, what's the deal with the concrete? And it's like, we got a big family. We need places to park when we have lunch on Sundays after church. And I was like, okay. And the right side is actually from an athletic field that is synthetic turf in Northern Virginia. And there's a lot of claims by people marketing synthetic grass that it is low input. And it certainly doesn't have the requirements for fertility and aeration, but believe it or not, that field is irrigated, as crazy as that sounds, because they try to use the water to cool it because its temperatures are so great. And the part about the low input synthetic turf that nobody ever talks about is how do you dispose of that thing after 8, 9, 10 years of use. And now you've got to get rid of 2 acres of artificial turf and whatever infill is in place. And that is a very significant chunk of change. Each one of these systems has got strengths and weaknesses, okay? So I went digging through the literature and putting this talk together because I knew I'd seen this. And the picture quality here, I'm sorry, is not very good from the scan I was able to take, but this is actually a research trial that was published by a graduate student from Purdue University. And the young lady's major professor is Dr. Cale Bigelow. And Cale is actually from Northern Virginia. He got 2 degrees from Virginia Tech and a PhD from NC State. And he's been at Purdue as a turfgrass scientist for probably 22, 23 years. And he's done quite well for himself there, a top-notch turf specialist. And he had a master's student do a really basic but very interesting project in which her whole thing was to basically assess public perception of 4 different types of lawns based on their management inputs. So you see the date, we're going all the way back to July of 2006, but A is an integrated pest management program. And that's the one that I will spend most of my time talking to people about. It's making decisions based on understanding what you have present in that lawn. And you look at it, it looks quite good. Very limited pest pressure that you see there. B, just to the right of that, is a consumer program that's coming straight off the shelf from something like a Scotts or Pennington Corporation. And as you might anticipate, it's going to be pretty pest-free. And most of the pests that we see here aren't really major things. It's mostly things such as clover, which we could argue has got some value for lawns because it does. C on the left is a natural organic program, okay, designated as NOP. And then D, you might suspect this looking at how much is in there. And some people would say that's actually an attractive lawn. I like that with all that clover. That is the no input program. So those were the 4 different scenarios which were maintained. And she got lots of data back and forth from the general public about what they liked, what they didn't like, etc. She basically came up with the conclusion that all programs, except the one in which we didn't do anything, provided satisfactory lawn appearance and green color. And there also were people in those programs that thought all those weeds looked just fine. And again, that's a valid opinion. But when it comes to turfgrass quality, the primary feature most people are looking for, I'd say there are 2. One is green color, but the other one is the uniformity. And that's what people are most interested in is can I make this look uniform? While the NOP, that program, the natural organic program, it was sufficiently green. Broadleaf weeds started to enter into the landscape. That detracted from overall appearance. There is a real challenge with gaining broadleaf weed control with most of our organic products. So things that we use to treat perennial broadleaves, they typically do a great job of burning the foliage, but unfortunately they don't kill the secondary tissue, all the reproductive tissue, which shows up. So that is a concern. And to this day, that remains something that we struggle with, even to control something like a dandelion. That can we get that taproot and all those growing points? The answer is we can burn it, but rarely can we control it. The third bullet says, additionally, the economic benefits of scouting were calculated and show that IPM is economically feasible. And that's what so much of us on the turf team down at Tech try to train folks that are professional lawn care people with their employees is as much IPM as you can do with your employees, training them to identify what the pest is, whether or not that pest warrants a pesticide application. And once you get it to a stage of where you've got most of these pests under control, you probably aren't going to need the chemistry. That's the angle that we take most effectively in terms of training our LCOs. The one thing that Ms. Caceres said was that we did nothing to calculate anything about mowing. And there would be some slight differences in mowing requirements, but that was not part of this particular study. And she put together some data here comparing what the cost would be in dollars per acre. And it may or may not surprise you, but the consumer / calendar driven programs, which are coming from the like the Scott's 3-4-step program that you put out a pre-emerge and a summarizer and a winterizer and maybe something for an insect management program. These are basically 2010 type prices. So they would have gone up now, but I think the relative ratios will be about the same. $2,700 for that one, cost per acre. If you use the IPM and scouting program, right at about $2,000. And surprising to some is that the natural organic approach is quite a bit more expensive, almost twice as much as the IPM and scouting program, because these natural organic programs are certainly not inexpensive. So between those fertilizers, the very unique forms of biological products that we try to control things with, very significant costs. And no input, since we're not counting mowing, didn't cost me anything. But again, we've got a lawn that was very shaky in terms of its credibility as a lawn. Again, that's up to the owner to say it is or is not acceptable. But when you consider uniformity and green color, of course, it's not going to compete with the other systems. Her final points were, note that, again, these observations and data that were collected over people that are providing her responses, it's only over 2 seasons. Long term, do you think other things are going to be happening in these lawns? And the answer is, of course. Is it possible that some weed or insect pests could become problematic? Well, many of you all up in that neck of the woods, hopefully none of you had to deal with this in person, but you probably heard of last year's record-breaking populations of fall armyworms. We have never seen fall armyworms at those levels in Virginia. And the Richmond market was just absolutely decimated, with people literally having grasses die essentially overnight because of such pressure. So we never know what Mother Nature has in store with us, with either pests like a fall armyworm or with extremes in drought or temperature. So all those are fair game to say, could these data change? Of course they could. But her study set us up for framework that we applied, again, in expanding what we felt were the logical steps that are taken in trying to get people to consider that IPM and scouting is a really good way of managing a turf and reducing pesticide and fertility applications that come along with that. These are the type of things I think that you all are becoming quite adept at being able to offer advice to people that would seek you as master gardeners in terms of telling them what to do. And the final point was, and this was part of her trying to convince people that this is acceptable, and she said this was very difficult to get them to understand, but consumers should be willing to accept a less than perfect lawn. And keep in mind that brown can be the new green, and that is especially the case when we consider the fact that turf grasses enter dormancy for survival, and 99 times out of 100 during those dormancy phases, as long as the moisture is restored, typically 6, 7, 8 weeks, those grasses will almost always rebound fine. So this is a publication. If you say, I'd like to see more about that, more specifics, there's that citation down at the bottom. It's Hort Technology, 2010, volume 20, pages 418 to 426. We don't get a lot of these papers in the scientific literature, but I thought this was a pretty interesting one that took a little bit different approach rather than just traditional chemicals or cultivar evaluations, things along that line. Now, what are you looking for? And this is always a question that comes up when somebody tells me, give me a recommendation, okay? And what is that recommendation? Those 4 pictures I had for you at first about which one of those, does one of those fit your needs for a lawn? And I'm always asked, and those of you who heard me speak before, hear me talk about my yard. My yard is a good yard, but it's not a pest-free lawn. I never think a lawn should be that. I don't think that's possible to achieve, and don't think you should attempt to achieve that. But I do have a lawn from the perspective of what I do for a living. I kind of feel like I should have a decent looking lawn. It might be embarrassing for a turf specialist to have a bad lawn. Many of my colleagues are just the opposite. It's like they don't care. The last thing they want to do is work in their lawn. So you got to find out from people, what are their expectations in terms of having a lawn that meets their perspective. So you all know that a big part of the research program that myself and my team lead at Virginia Tech has to do with variety evaluations. This is one from a couple of years ago, and we'll be meeting with our colleagues from University of Maryland and my Hampton Roads AREC people, Dr. Durr and Mr. Adam Nichols. Usually it'd be typically late May to early June, and we'll develop the 2022-23 Virginia Turfgrass Variety Recommendation List. But use this as much as you can. It'll challenge you. Definitely your big box stores aren't going to be carrying these varieties on purpose. It pretty much is by accident if they happen to be in there. And but many of the most popular and larger seed suppliers, places like a Pennington, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't have blends or mixtures that have at least a couple of these named varieties. So take this piece of information with you if you're shopping for seed or giving recommendations and seeing what's out there. These are all based on field trials of 5 to 6 years where we get the best performing cultivars. I was praying for fall armyworm damage last year on my plots, and they took over everything but. They ravaged Dr. McCall's brown patch study, and I'm sitting right here trying to shoo them up the hill to my tall fescue research trial, and they never made it there. But that's the type of thing that we like to have happen in our research plots so that we could tell you which ones would be attacked, which ones appeared to be somewhat tolerant of these different pests. So again, these trials go on for years at a time. They're replicated, and you look at the big geographical triangle that we use. You're all actually closer to College Park, Maryland than you are Blacksburg, and we work with the University of Maryland putting together these recommendations, because what I do in Blacksburg doesn't necessarily apply to you all, and it definitely doesn't apply very well to what's going on at Virginia Beach. So all of our data are combined, and you'll always be able to find this on the Virginia Cooperative Extension website. Now I'm going to talk about the grasses specific to it, and this might be a little bit of a surprise, but we tend to take tall fescue for granted, and it is very much kind of a catch-all grass. But with this grass, I'm going to start off with it as what I think is a low input grass that also brings in probably the best in visual quality that we can achieve, with also having some low input characteristics. And overall, I describe it as it's Achilles heel, and so over on the right side, really the only Achilles heel that tall fescue has, and I guess I can think of two of them, but one is Rhizoctonia blight, aka brown patch. And we have cultivars. Most of those cultivars that are on our list probably have pretty good brown patch tolerance, but I'll never say resistance, because I've never seen a tall fescue that is resistant to brown patch. And the other thing with tall fescues is every single one of them requires you to have a sharp mower blade. And that is the number one disease. I tell people when I do my Master Gardener volunteer training, the number one disease on tall fescue is not brown patch. It's dull mower disease. So that's its two Achilles heels. Outside of that, in terms of its performance in the fall and the spring, it's probably one of the best looking grasses, most quickly out of the gate in the spring and holding on to its color in the fall. It's got the deepest root system of any of the cool season grasses that we grow. So that's a phenomenal factor in terms of performing under low moisture conditions. Also under higher heat, it tends to do quite well. And then we've got lots and lots and lots of choices. I mean, in our current variety trial at Tech and Hampton Roads and University of Maryland, there's 135 entries in that trial. And about half of them are named cultivars, and the other half would love to be. Most of them probably won't make it to market. They just won't perform in our climate, but that's the type of thing we're trying to determine. This is a non-invasive species, so it's not going to be a problem for you in your plant beds. And its irrigation requirement is only if you need to maintain it as an active growing grass. Other than that, I say leave this grass alone and let it do its thing. And if it should enter dormancy, which would be very unusual, but if it should, that's exactly what your grasses are supposed to do. And the other thing that I want to talk a little more about this later, but I'm not going to say too much right now about Kentucky bluegrass, because Kentucky bluegrass, I don't call it a low input grass. This is one, those of you who heard me speak, I call this the bells and whistles grass. It's a beautiful grass. I think it's probably the prettiest turf grass that we maintain. Dark green color, beautiful mowing, striping potential. But this is a grass that requires much higher inputs. It needs the fertilizer. It needs irrigation. It gets more grub pressure than the other grasses do, and it produces thatch since it's a creeper. But here is something for us to ponder a little bit further, and this came from the sod industry, and they were doing this well before any of the researchers had figured this out. The sod people for a long time now were growing bluegrass and tall fescue together, and basically about the time that the improved turf-type tall fescues came out in the early 1980s, so think back to when you first heard about the original Rebel series of tall fescues, they realized that Kentucky bluegrass would mix quite well with tall fescue, because most people don't even realize it's two different grasses in combination. And what they also discovered is kind of the sweet spot for what it should be. It's about 90% tall fescue and 10% Kentucky bluegrass by weight, or 95 and 5 of tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. And if you go more Kentucky bluegrass in there, like in the slide I have listed as 15% Kentucky bluegrass, 85% tall fescue, you basically in a few years will end up with Kentucky bluegrass. And that's what we're not trying to do here. We're trying to keep a two grass system, because as you see in that picture, you've got much better color with that combination. So that's immediately an attention grabber. You've also got the deep root system and better spring and fall color of tall fescue. And if something should damage that system, then you've got the recuperative potential of the Kentucky bluegrass and its rhizomatous growth habit. So I'm giving you an argument to say that while I'm not going to talk about Kentucky bluegrass as a standalone, do think about bluegrass in combination at very small, on a percent by weight basis, very small levels as a really valid component. Because the other thing that we've noted is that we have less brown patch from this combination, and we have less summer patch, which is Kentucky bluegrass's biggest disease problem in our climate. I won't say we'll never have those diseases, but we definitely see less. And my colleague at the Hampton Roads AREC, a young man that leads their research program in terms of maintaining the field work, is Mr. Adam Nichols. And Adam did a trial several years ago where he looked at tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass alone. Then he looked at various ratio combinations of seed at 1-to-1 ratios, tall fescue to bluegrass, or 9-to-1, with this one emphasizing obviously more Kentucky bluegrass. So 1 month after seeding, his turf cover was definitely seen in the tall fescue. And you can see again this picture here pointing to the tall fescue plot already needs to be mowed, whereas Kentucky bluegrass is really just starting to come in. So one was 70% covered, the other is 40. And of course, due to competition, one had a whole lot more of the primary weed pressure, which he faced over there, which was purple dead nettle. And again, the slower the establishing grass, then the more weed pressure that comes in purely due to the lack of competition. And these combos, again, anything with the same letter means that they all basically performed the same statistically. So they're all between 10 and 15%, whereas this one's up around 23, 24%. And again, that's not a surprise because you would anticipate a faster establishing grass. What's changing with the bluegrasses though, and part of what they're doing in improving bluegrasses is used to be 14 to 21 day germination for Kentucky bluegrass, this plot. Now they're getting these things down to 7 days with the new research that's gone on in variety development. And that is that'll flip our world of understanding of bluegrasses somewhat upside down as these grasses start to come to market. And again, I'm going to say a little bit more about bluegrasses later on because I end up talking more about bluegrasses than I probably should for low input turf, but there are some really interesting and scientifically exciting things going on with bluegrass development as our plant breeders are trying to reintroduce that quote unquote high input turf back into our market in a more low input package. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about in a second. This was the brown patch data that Adam had. And this goes along with where I was telling you about the combos. Tall fescue alone at the end of the season, he had about 40% brown patch in terms of surface area, whereas Kentucky bluegrass really doesn't get brown patch. But the combinations where you put the two together, the weakening effect of the bluegrass combination on the brown patch population, it's huge. It's very dramatic in terms of what goes on with these combinations, even when there is just a little bit of Kentucky bluegrass in there, okay? It still brings that percentage down to about 10%. So there's something going on in terms of keeping Mother Nature somewhat off balance in terms of this disease pressure that comes from this combination. And this is another one that I don't think will surprise you. This was another researcher at Hampton Roads, Dr. Matt Catelli. Matt was working on a PhD there with Dr. Jeff Durr probably about 10 years or so ago. And part of Matt's project was to evaluate how successful Bermuda grass was encroaching into tall fescue on the basis of different management programs. And one of the most obvious ones, which very quickly distinguished itself, saying, well, one of your best ways to try to keep Bermuda grass at bay is to increase your cutting height. So I think you would all say, well, that's pretty logical because you fight wiregrass all the time, which is all Bermuda grass is. That's just our slang name for it, the common types we have. So this is looking at square centimeters of Bermuda grass coverage in what was installed as a tall fescue stand. And if your cutting height here is at 2.5 inches, okay, you had a whole lot more Bermuda grass in terms of the population shift because mowing it closer moves the competitive advantage to that plant, Whereas if you can mow it at 4 inches, which as we see here in the orange line, we've got quite a bit less, actually about 50% less Bermuda grass encroachment. And visually, it's kind of hard to see at first, although if you look carefully, you see these little fine stems, fine leaves of the Bermuda grass. But what Matt did was he actually went out and quantified these more precisely as he made these measurements. And now you can really see what's going on there and how much reduced pressure there is where you mow this grass at 4 inches, the 10 centimeter height. Again, not a surprise. It's one of our best means of at least suppressing Bermuda grass is to simply raise the height. And this is a couple of shots here that were taken again of these differential mowing heights, 2.5 inches and 4 inches. And you see it almost appears to have a scalping appearance over there. When you've got tall fescue in Virginia Beach in the middle of summer, it's not going to be a beautiful grass. It's kind of in survival mode. And there's so much more color in the 4-inch tall grass. And there's so much less because not only was Bermuda grass an issue, all of a sudden here comes crabgrass, here comes Dallas grass, here comes thin paspalum. And this is not a perfect system, right? You look right there and say, well, what's that? Well, that's our friend brown patch. So even taller mowed turf, there's no basis for brown patch not to say I'd be very happy eating you as well. So it's still going to be there, but we definitely do not have all the pressure that comes from the summer annuals and those perennials that are in there. They're all warm season. And again, very common sense. One of your biggest challenges, and this was raised last night, was, well, Dr. Goatley, where do I get a mower that cuts 4 inches? And I'm like, that is a great question. And that's a question that I can't answer because most of our homeowner mowers that we have access to, that most people are going to say, I'll pay that much for a mower. You would be lucky to be able to get a 3-inch cutting height out of those mowers. It is done on purpose for safety reasons, trying to ensure that everything stays under the deck. So I share your pain about that because I'd love to see us be able to cut grass taller without having to have special equipment. But right now, that is a real world limitation that we face, is that these mowers aren't designed to mow taller. Most cases, what I see is about 2 3/4 inches. And we'd love them to cut taller than that for the sake of the health of the grass. So my summary comments, you're going to make fescues work for you and justify tall fescue as a lower input grass. You use the recommended turf types. They continue to evolve in terms of maintenance requirements about mowing even. There are some of these things now which they're terming dwarf turf type tall fescues. And they're not dwarf from the standpoint of like the difference between mondo grass and mini mondo grass, but they are slower growing. Think about mixing them with bluegrass. As I told you, blue is not a low input turf. So your answer might be, it depends, would I or wouldn't I? But our sod colleagues have shown us that those 90-10 combinations do have quite a few strengths, especially when it comes to visual quality and disease suppression. Fertilize these grasses primarily in the fall. So 2/3 to 3/4 seasonal nitrogen goes out September, October, November, and 1/3, 1/4 about this time of year. And never forget that it is still a cool season grass in the transition zone. And you're going to have seasons where it's not going to do well. And so you should simply be prepared to do spot renovations. And your don'ts, just giving you 2 of them. If you can cut at 3 inches, do that. And general rule of thumb, leave it taller. Taller is going to reduce overall stress and pressure on these grasses. And definitely do not aggressively fertilize in the spring. That is a major contributing factor to the formation of brown patch in that turf. So again, starting off with what I think is our most common grass and arguing that it does have low input characteristics. But now let's truly go to the lowest input turf that we can grow in the mid-Atlantic. And that would be fine leaf fescue, for which there are about 4 different species. Sheep fescue is a species of fine leaf fescue, but it's mostly used as an ornamental. And in the world of fine leaf fescues, you hear about things such as creeping red, which has very short rhizomes, chewings, and hard fescue. So those are the 3 that are grown as turf grasses. They quite often are mixed together. They are individual species, but I can't tell them apart until they flower and produce a seed head, and then I need a hand lens. And I tell people, if you can identify it as fine fescue, I think you're in pretty good shape. But in the background of this picture, you see what is generally described as its biggest weakness, which it's a visual weakness. Most people don't like its texture. It actually is too fine bladed. And it's described to me by people that see it. It's like, I don't like that. It looks like pine straw growing from the ground. And it does somewhat look like pine straw from the ground. But this grass, when maintained as a lawn, is our highest quality, lowest input, cool season turf grass. And I say that, period. We did a simulated cemetery trial several years ago on campus, and our purpose was to identify what was the best grass possible for, having a nice cemetery site, but that required the least inputs in terms of mowing and weed eating around all those headstones or footstones. And the cool season grass winner was fine fescue. And I'll show you the warm season winner in just a second here. Also remember that this grass has the best shade tolerance of the cool season turf grasses, period. This is the most shade tolerant. It doesn't like deep shade. If you get 3 or 4 hours of light per day, you can successfully grow fine fescue. I'll show you a shot from Virginia Beach just in a second, let you see how well it does compared to tall fescue. Now, other challenges. There are essentially no sod producers in the area that I'm aware of, either in Maryland or Virginia. We used to have one in Virginia, but they're no longer producing fine fescue sod. And even your seed sources are quite limited because, again, people develop things on the basis of market demand. And this isn't a grass that tends to be in very high demand. Its weaknesses outside of its appearance, which appearance is subjective, but its weaknesses, I would tell you, don't plant it if you have a lot of traffic on your lawns. If you got lots of kids and pets, one of the things that fine fescue does not like is a lot of foot or vehicular traffic. And it also performs very poorly in poorly drained soils. So we use it a great deal in Virginia on highway rights of way. And those really poor soils, oftentimes with southern exposures, a cool season grass that can hang in there both in sun or shade, that's where these grasses will find their niche. But it's not the prettiest grass. It is just a top-notch, low input turf grass if that visual appearance doesn't faze you. And here's the shot I was telling you from Virginia Beach. And this is like one of the ultimate shade research trials that I've ever seen. This is actually an old hardwood planting over there. Virginia Beach Station was the truck crop research station for many years. And part of what they had over there were also some forest research projects going on. So we've got a very nice uniform hardwood forest in there with individually spaced trees and lots of pretty nice uniform shade with just a little bit of light kind of making its way in either early in the morning or late in the afternoon. And if you look at the differences here, in the foreground here is a turf type tall fescue, and it's really struggling. It's probably now at about 70-75% density. And these are plots that only get mowed maybe twice a year with the bush hog. But behind this, okay, look at all this fine fescue. And unfortunately, I can't tell you which specific cultivars these are. These are all experimentals. Adam and Dr. Durr couldn't talk about them. But this is the type of performance that we see over and over with these fine fescues in the shade, even in a climate as hot as Virginia Beach. In this instance, I think probably that the shade is actually providing these grasses a little bit of relief. So take a look at this grass. If you don't have a lot of traffic, you're looking for something to install that is definitely lower input, this is your lower input turf grass of the cool season world. And now we're going to be a little bit more controversial for some, and then others you'd say, oh, I agree 100%. We're going to talk about one warm season turf grass. It is not going to be Bermuda grass, because if there's anything that doesn't describe Bermuda grass, it's low input. But the one we want to talk about, and you have quite a bit up there, and again, not everyone's preference, but you see a bunch of it. This was an article that I was quoted in last year. Many of you all probably read Adrian Higgins' Home and Garden column in the Washington Post. And Adrian calls me from time to time to ask a turf question. And last year he called me, and Adrian's very direct, and he's like, I want you to give me one grass that you think is the highest quality, lowest input turf that we should be growing. And I started the old it depends. And he's like, nope, I asked you for one. And I thought for a second, and I said, all right, I got one for you. My one is going to be Zoysia grass. And then I explained why. And I do think that Zoysia grass, in terms of overall maintenance requirements, a very limited pest pressure. About the only thing it gets is a little bit of a disease called large patch, which is, it's comparable to brown patch on tall fescue, but on Zoysia grass, it would occur in the fall or spring when it's slowing down. And it is a creeper, but it's a very slow creeper. And of course, the major reason people don't want Zoysia grass is right there. And a slide that many of you see me use before. There's a great story behind this between the husband and wife, and the husband loves the lawn and the wife hates the lawn and is embarrassed that they've got the brown grass in the neighborhood. And when I took this picture, I thought it was just a lovely grass. But again, I spent 15 years in Mississippi and learned to appreciate true dormancy periods for all the warm season grasses there. But this is the classic golden brown dormant Zoysia grass color. What's always intriguing to me is no one has any issues with those hardwoods dropping their leaves and having no color, but it's just totally unacceptable for that Zoysia grass lawn to not be green. But remember that that is a brown lawn that is actually a green lawn in terms of its maintenance requirements, because there's no mowing, there's no fertility, there's no irrigation. Matter of fact, in that case, probably at some point they did a little spot spraying for weeds, but now that canopy is so thick that basically it's providing its own weed control. Now, it's not perfect. Zoysia grass over time, it's going to produce a little thatch. I tell people usually about every 5th year, you probably need to verticut this lawn. And I told you about large patch disease. And the other factor about it is paying for it. Since it is so much slower growing than other grasses, when you put in a vegetative Zoysia grass, you're going to pay more for that, probably 2.5 times what you'd pay for tall fescue or Bermuda grass, because the sod producer is going to, basically put that money towards how long they had to tie up their production field. But I think this is the lowest input, highest quality grass that we can grow. And it even has pretty decent shade tolerance. So again, not perfect, but it serves a lot of our purposes. The challenge is, if any of y'all remember the old Andy Griffith show, the early episodes of Black and White, which are, to me, that's the only ones I care about watching. It was the kerosene cucumber episode when Aunt Bee doesn't really know how to make pickles. And the whole context here was that Barney and Andy eventually had to learn to love to eat those kerosene cucumbers. And it's the same thing with these warm season grasses like Zoysia grass. You have to learn to love that dormancy period and say, I can live with that. And remember that you must have green. I wouldn't want you to overseed it, but I would want you to consider coloring it with some of the new turf colorants. So again, the turf paints that instead of them being, Hokie maroon and orange, or UVA blue and orange, or Washington Commanders scarlet and gold, you paint these things green. And we've got turf paints and turf colorants, which you wouldn't know if that's actually growing grass or painted grass in terms of its color. And that's how you can get green color in the winter. And one of our arguments for these warm season grasses like a Zoysia grass is that cool season grasses require on average 30% more water than warm season grasses. That's just across the board. Zoysia is not as good in water tolerance or drought tolerance as is Bermuda, but again, it doesn't have that extremely invasive nature. So don't give up on Zoysia grass as a low input option. Last few comments, and I'm going to pause. I'm going to check out your questions in the chat box here when I finish with Zoysia. This is how I summarize it. Its density is really second to none when it comes to grasses. People talk about it. They just like to take their shoes and socks off and walk through this grass because it truly is a piece of carpet. It is very slow growing. That makes it a strength and a weakness depending on where you're at in terms of its establishment. It only needs 1 to 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet annually. Matter of fact, most zoysia grasses, once they're mature, they would definitely be in that 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 range. It's got good drought tolerance, not great. Why isn't it used more? Dormancy period and cost of establishment, since most of the improved cultivars are established vegetatively, and you have to wait for that thing to fill in. It just doesn't happen overnight, but once you get it, you definitely will have a very slow growing, ultra dense turf grass. And I put a few pictures in. This was the very first Xeon zoysia grass lawn that was installed in Virginia. And this was put in Williamsburg. And this is 4 weeks after the sod was installed. This was Xeon as a variety. And look how beautiful it is, emerald green color. But I want you to look at this picture here in the year of establishment and how awesome this looks in this deep shade on the side. And when I was talking to Mr. Tom Rogers, he's a master gardener over in James City County. And I said, Tom, I got my question about that right there. And he's like, yeah, but look at it now. That's beautiful. And it was. But I'll come back to another shot from this just a little bit later the next season. So here's Tom. He got written up in the local paper there by their horticulture writer, Kathy Van Mollekam. And Tom, still this day, this lawn is now 12 years old, and it still looks good. One input that he had to add was a mower that could handle this caliber of turf due to its density. And so again, you want to argue about inputs. Well, that was something he hadn't planned on, having to buy a more powerful mower, but his little push mower that he had, he's like, you can't cut this stuff with it. So again, give and take. But here's what it looked like in December. And Tom's wife told me, I'll get you, Goatley, if I have a brown yard. And I'm like, no, ma'am, we're going to take care of that. So this is the morning of December 17th. And I was coming through and I told Tom, we're going to deal with your lawn today. And once I show you how to do this from this point forward, this is yours. And that's what he's done every year. But here's morning of, and this is afternoon of. And this was with an old school turf dye called Green Launder, Lawnger. And this is not, to me, the best looking green, but it is green and it stays green because this is a colorant and you're no longer mowing it. And that greening effect leads to a more rapid warming in the spring, because here it was in April of the following year. Now, it's still a showcase lawn and coming out of dormancy even that early. You see the flowers in bloom there. So it is zoysia grass that was able to get a jump start because of the colorant that was used. And his prideful moment came from all of his neighbors were ragging him about having the dead yard over winter. And he's like, well, it wasn't dead after I painted it. Was the line between his property and the neighbor's property when they're trying to grow tall fescue in Williamsburg. Summer stress has definitely reared up, brown patch, etc. And you see Tom's lawn, again, his biggest challenge was I had to ramp up my mower and go to more horsepower. But I've certainly got a lawn now that scoffs at the Williamsburg summer and comes through just fine. There's the one I wanted you to remember, though. Remember how pretty I said that was, but I had my question? It's not a silver bullet grass. You put it in deep shade, poorly drained soils, a lot of standing water. And this is what I told Tom. I said, I got no suspicions you're going to do great out there in the front yard in that sun. But back here where it's underneath the trees and it stays wet, and lo and behold, again, not a perfect grass, and there's no grass that's going to perform well in that deep a shade, and basically in a situation when it gets wet and it stays wet. So every grass I've told you, it has some limiting factor, but to me, these were the three that I call the lowest input turf grasses that we could discuss. Last slide and then the questions. So you're going to make zoysia work. Do be prepared that you're going to pay for it. You're going to have a higher horsepower mower to cut through the stuff. There's just so much biomass. You won't need to have a lot of irrigation. You probably aren't going to be applying much, if any at all, pesticide, because it's got very low pest pressure. And it likes to be mowed somewhere between 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches. It does fine at 2.5 inches. The challenge with that is, again, so much biomass to cut through. Don't aggressively fertilize it. A pound of nitrogen per 1,000 per year is all you need. Don't plant it in deep shade. It's better than Bermuda grass, but it is not great. And there's where I'm going to pause. Let's check out the chat. And I saw someone's hand go up there, but now I'd like to take your questions and comments, and let's scroll here and let's see what we got going on. Okay, so Natalie told you got questions. Can't see the very bottom, sorry. And I will find you that last citation. Gene, if you'll tell me which one that is, we'll make sure we get that for you. So Natalie says we're going to check on that. Okay, phosphorus question. Virginia nutrient management standards and criteria allow up to 0.75 pounds per thousand annually. What will be the impact of grass quality if this is not applied to turf in the autumn? Great question. If you don't need it on the basis of what your soil test tells you, I definitely would not worry about applying it. And if you've had a soil test that showed you were medium to high 3 or 4 years ago, my impression is you're still going to be in great shape. So no, I would not simply put out the phosphorus because standards and criteria allows us to apply it, because I think that is an element that we want to make applications on the basis of the soil test. So I don't think you'll be gaining anything. Don't think you're going to miss anything either unless you're actually deficient. And then can you mix Zoysia with other types such as the Fescues? We have tried that. It's a great idea. So far, we had very poor success with that combo. Essentially, even in the mountains of Southwest Virginia, where I thought maybe the two would coexist, one of those grasses consumes the other one because of its density, and it's the Zoysia grass. And so we used that combo as basically, as far as we used tall fescue as a nurse crop for Zoysia grass in our trials over at the beach. And about the second season, the tall fescue began to check out, and the Zoysia grass essentially choked it out. And there's so little of it left that we made the call during the winter to go ahead and chemically remove it while the Zoysia was dormant. What we have been doing, and again, it wouldn't fall under the low input category, but this is being used successfully at several locations around the mid-Atlantic and kind of mid-south over into Kentucky, Tennessee, those places are two combos which are giving us in the right location, right management, two perennial grasses. We call one Blue Muta, which again, you can imagine that's not a low input turf because it's a combo of bluegrass and Bermuda grass, with the intent being a permanent two-grass system. The bluegrass takes over in the fall and does its thing through the spring, and then the Bermuda grass comes back around. It's not perfect, but I've got systems in golf courses and sports fields where that's working well. And my colleague that used to be at University of Kentucky, Dr. Greg Munshaw, said no reason that couldn't fit lawns, but he said the one that he believes has the most application for lawns, and again, may or may not fit your definition of low input, but he said Fesmuta, and a combination of improved turf-type tall fescues and Bermuda grass. And he has some beautiful plots at the University of Kentucky that were persisting as perennial two-grass systems. So those are things that we continue to explore. But that's a great question about Zoysia and tall fescue. They actually tried that on the National Mall several years ago, and great idea, just didn't work. And it's because the Zoysia grass is ultimately so dense, it just crowds the poor tall fescue out. See here what Leanne says, Zoysia grass, love it. However, I'm getting a lot of ground ivy, okay? Particularly over septic field, best time to use that. T-zone would be the one that comes to mind, but that be a case, Leanne, be very careful with that label. This would be one that if you will think to email me when we're done, goatley@vt.edu. Let's get Dr. Askew or Dr. Durr to give you the best recommendation possible here, because there are certain herbicides in warm season turf grasses that can cause surprisingly more damage than you would anticipate. And ground ivy is one of those for which we've got some real challenges. There's a brand new product that I doubt you're going to have access to yet, but with what I've seen in its performance in the field, the product is called, its trade name is called Game On. And it's a three-way combination of a couple of new active ingredients and another product's been out there for a while called fluroxapyr, but I think it's probably not yet available in the homeowner market. But email me at Goatley, and I'll write that in down here. Anyone that has questions, please let me know and I'll get back with you. But my email, goatley@bt.edu, and send that to you in the chat. All right, and now let me scroll back up and see what other questions came in. Okay, when's it okay to spot seed dead spots in the lawn here in Northern Virginia in the spring? Jan, I would do that as soon as you can. I wouldn't wait any longer. Why I say that is Mother Nature is going to be in charge of this based on temperature and moisture anyway. And the earlier you get it out there, the better I think you will be. And just do something to scratch those spots to get some good soil to seed contact. But go ahead and do that now rather than waiting, because even a weekend, I was thinking, hey, spring's arrived in Blacksburg. And when I got home, my wife, Lisa, said, hey, you're going to be 18 degrees here in another couple of nights. So much for spring here. And I'm sure you're all going to get cold as well. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, we're going to come back to that one if I could help. The citation missed was a study done on 4 different lawns. I will get back to that when we finish, and we'll go back to that program and I'll get that for you, or email me and I'll make sure I copy it for you. So my apologies if you couldn't see it. And is there anything else? All right. Any other questions on this earlier info that you'd like to type in? And I'll just pause for a second, take me a sip of water. And if there's anything else you'd like to say.
This is Natalie. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I was just reading our Master Gardener handbook, and I just wanted some clarification on the law, the Virginia law that prohibits the sale of synthetic fertilizers with phosphorus for maintenance purposes. So I needed some clarification on that. And then the next sentence says phosphorus fertilizers are, however, allowed to be used for establishing new plantings or for use on sites that are low in phosphorus, according to soil test result.
Yeah, so basically, we don't yet have any regulations saying you can't, but if you notice and it's not very, I think it's worked out okay, but the only thing that Virginia literally asked retailers to do, and they did some inspections and checking, here's what we want. They essentially said, you know what, we got to quit applying so much phosphorus, because for all intents and purposes, when you get phosphorus where it needs to be in a native soil, you're going to be there for several years in the future. And we need people get away from just applying complete fertilizers with N, P, and K as a rule of thumb. So they split, and they talk about the maintenance fertilizers, which are phosphate free. And the idea is that you come into a retailer that all of those fertilizers are going to be grouped together. And so you see things that'll be either straight nitrogen or they'll be nitrogen and potash, but the middle number is always going to be 0. And they separated them from what they called the garden or the starter fertilizers, which then took the traditional 3-way combos of mixed fertilizers. And for all intents and purposes right now, that is how Virginia decided to handle this education about we don't want you to. DCR, DEQ, they had no desire to get into having to regulate this. We had some crazy ideas back in the day about you were going to have to bring in a soil test to buy phosphorus. And of course, the fertilizer industry went ballistic about you can't have a checkout clerk interpreting soil tests, et cetera. But that's how serious people were getting about these things. So right now, we're trying to get people to soil test. If you don't need the phosphorus, don't apply it. And since a lot of people just buy fertilizer from the standpoint of, I don't know what a soil test is, but I know I need to put some fertilizer down, they try to separate the two and send you over to maintenance fertilizer. It's going to be phosphorus free. And everything you said, Natalie, the one little additional caveat that DCR says we're going to give you is for establishment, you get to apply a little bit of extra phosphorus, even based on what a soil test might say, because there is great value in the initial formation of roots from either sod or from seed. And that's why that additional statement is in the standards and criteria.
And is that establishing like a totally new lawn when phosphorus can be applied, or can it be like little pieces of sod or something?
I think it could be anything, but what DCR would be hoping is if you were doing it for little pieces, that you're only putting that phosphorus in those areas in which you're trying to establish. So my guess is they're primarily thinking brand new establishments as the focal point. And that's just a scientific guess, but I don't think they would want to get into the business of trying to tell people to go out there and sprinkle handfuls of phosphorus for these spot treatments. And again, it's my scientific guess, but I don't think that would be their intention.
Thank you. And one more question with fall armyworm. Do you have any information about what to expect for this year? I had one gentleman ask me already. So just kind of what you expect, or you're not sure, or you can't really tell what's going to happen.
Yeah, the Dr. Kuhar, Dr. Del Pozo, who are both entomologists, that turf is not their primary focus, but they do a great job for us serving as turf entomologists. They said no rhyme or reason to expect that we will have another year like that one. And Tom has been here for 24 years, and he said, I have never seen armyworm pressure like that. And it was all based on particular weather patterns for last year that were bringing the moths. And again, however it clicked, they brought them in some cases. We basically had 3 waves. The first 2 waves got most of Virginia. The third wave kind of scooted up Southwest Virginia and then went over into places like Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. But we'd never seen armyworm pressure. He said there's no reason to believe that it will occur again. But yeah, it took everyone by surprise because we had not seen it. Let's see, I see Leanne had a question about armyworms in Zoysia. They did eat it, but it wasn't their preferred host. Same thing for Bermuda grass. It seemed to be far and away that tall fescue was where the armyworms migrated to. And I was watching fall armyworms at the Tech golf course that they would crawl around a crabgrass plant and go eat something else. So Dr. Kuhar said, you can't, that's not publishable information. He goes, but I saw the same thing. And he goes, there was definitely a lot of selected feeding going on. And I see Alan asked about the paint question. Mr. Rogers painting with most of these products, I would say one day. And here's what I mean about one day. When Tom and I did that demo on his lawn, we had a really elaborate protocol. We each had a backpack sprayer with water as hot as we could get in there, add the paint, stirred it up, and we went out. He painted the back, I painted the front. Then we let it dry. We went in and drank a cold beverage and watched the first half of Tech and somebody in football. And then we went out after it dried, and I said, Tom, what do you think? And he goes, I think it needs one more coat. We went back out, walked not counterclockwise. We walked a different direction across the lawn again. We put 2 coats of paint. That took care of him for the season. And it was there until he started mowing his grass regularly next year. So at that time, it cost Tom, it was $85 to paint 5,000 square feet of area. But we did spend 2 efforts out there to put 2 coats on to make it look what we thought was the best. So what you saw was coat 1. That's why I said I'm not giving it as much credence. The second coat took it to a little bit better level. And I told Tom, your call. I'll paint if you want to. All right, so we'll do this again. When I get through, you all bring your questions back, and I'll answer, and I'll be here as long as you all need for tonight. But I'll get through for those of you who say we're going to end here at 8. Let's move our way on through. Let's see if I can get back to the screen. So a logical rollover place is inputs come down. Well, how often do you have to mow? And do keep in mind that certain grasses that are more aggressive, which I didn't list these, like bluegrass, they require much more frequent mowing, but you got to consider mowing as part of your input and your decisions about how you define low input. On this slide, again, the slowest growing grasses that we have are fine leaf fescue and zoysia grass. And you can grow zoysia as low as 1 inch, but that means you would really be committed to mowing. You could even grow fine leaf fescue to 1 inch, but it doesn't fit our protocol here because most people that I know that are growing fine leaf fescue here in the Blacksburg area are essentially treating it like they were there at the beach in those shade plots. It only gets mowed 3-4 times a year, and that's it. And so it's not a finely manicured lawn, and especially if you're on the side of a mountain around here, it's one of the best low input, reduced input grasses that you could possibly have. And in general, anytime that you can mow turf taller, again, within the limitations you have with your mowers, that's simply going to improve its overall turf health and its competitiveness with pests, because you're going to have a deeper root system. Anything that you can do to make informed decisions, just what you're all talking about with the phosphorus, is use your soil test, because a soil test is trying to predict nutrient availability to root systems. And if we need it, it would be actually irresponsible not to apply it. But in native soils, part of the the beauty and the curse is, if you got a really bad native soil, you got to do a lot of work to restore it. But once you do get to where you want it to be with all that clay that's in it, conversely, it basically is highly buffered and it stays in pretty good shape in terms of pH and nutrient levels for some time. But keep that in mind and think about a soil test needs to fit a low input program. And you all know, if you've heard me speak, you know how much of a fan I am of compost. And again, our limitations are primarily in how to get the stuff applied. But that's me from many years ago doing a duplicate research project to simulate what our colleagues at Penn State had found. And would it work the same in Virginia? And the answer was yes, it worked quite well. The rule of thumb is about a 1/4 inch depth of compost per application. Do that 1 to 2 times annually. If you got taller mowed turfs, you can cheat and take it up to a 1/2 inch, but I wouldn't go any more than that. And logically, if you could tie this together with punching holes, the core cultivation, whether it's done before or after the compost application, you're going to speed up the response in the soil. And what do you get from it? It doesn't happen in year 1, but year 2, you start to see something. And in year 3, you definitely start to see less moisture stress, better disease tolerance. Resistance is an inappropriate word there. It's not going to do anything for resistance, but it will improve tolerance. And you're probably going to have a likely overall reduced need of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. But one thing I do want you to remember is this is not an absolute replacement for fertility program, especially for nitrogen fertility program, because these materials are quite low in terms of their nutrient analysis. So NP and K are naturally quite low in these materials. But what we're doing is building soil health. And your challenges are, can you find good sources of these materials? What is their availability, their price? Do your research on what you're buying. And then how do you get the stuff out? We're still waiting for inexpensive and easily applied materials. And that's just not there yet. We don't have inexpensive ways to deliver these products. But depending on the source of the material that you buy, some of them will roll and flow through a rotary spreader. Most of the ones I have access to, they simply aren't, because they're not being screened and sized to that type of level. And what I did to show you some slides that you will have never seen is from some work that was completed on campus a few years ago, that we looked at several forms of composted biosolids, which you all certainly got plenty of that in your area. And matter of fact, most of these materials were coming from Blue Plains or Spotsylvania in terms of what we were using. And this was a project that was looking at these treatments, which you see in that background, the different biosolids that have been applied to these soils, and they get incorporated into these soils. But we also had plots, half the plots were irrigated, the other half the plots were non-irrigated, because we had a hypothesis that when you put this composted biosolid in these soils, well, these things ought to hold water a whole lot longer and stay greener. And that was our hypothesis. I'll show you how well that did or did not work here in a second. And we had basically 5 amendments to the soil. The first one was simply lime, PK, but using synthetic fertilizers, with urea being our basis for the nitrogen. And then we had 2 sources, which were basically Virginia Tech getting a biosolid product, but then we did our own little amendments with sand or sawdust and adjusted on the basis of nitrogen or phosphorus. And everything that we put out ultimately had the same N, P, pH, et cetera. So all these treatments received the same nutrients and liming. We had a dewatered biosolid, which is one that in its form would be safe to apply to a lawn, but you probably wouldn't want to. This one's a little more odor. Notice with that product, all these things have some odor, but that particular one, it could be used, but it would have some challenges. And a biosolids compost material that truly is treated as a compost and basically taken down to a known carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's a product that is commercially available. And this is one of the ones that comes out of Spotsylvania. And this was a research project for then PhD candidate, but now Dr. Mike Badsmarowski, who did this working with Dr. Greg Evanilo as his advisor. And Greg is our compost and biosolids specialist. So here's a background of what that looked like at the site. If you've ever been to the Turf Center, this is up on the top half. And this was graded literally as an overflowed runway back in the 1940s. And this was in when World War II was going on. If there was anything that needed to come and land at the Blacksburg Airport and they had not enough space, they had graded the top of the Turf Center and basically made themselves a solid clay runway. So you can imagine how ineffective it has been for the last 70, 80 years at growing grass. And we've always struggled with it for growing grass, but this made a great spot to test amendments. And so this was defined as a tilled urban disturbed soil. Its particle size analysis says, yep, this thing is majority clay with all the benefits and detractions that come with clay. And its soil chemical properties, we were interested in those top 4 inches. pH was 5.1, soil organic content 0.3%, actually tested out median in both phosphorus and potash. And that's because over the years, we've been trying to use this area as for research site. And Don, you've been here before, and this is up near the pavilion to give you an idea about where this site is. And here are the treatments, and I'm going to go through these quickly, but I just want you to see that obviously biosolids are quite variable in their composition, their release rates, because these are materials which do contain enough nitrogen, especially this one, 3.1, 0.2. This is pretty close to 3.3% nitrogen, but its mineralization rate, as we anticipate that over a year's time, only about a third, 30%, only about a third of that material is released. And each of these sources had somewhat different nitrogen release rates from organic to plant available. They also had different phosphorus levels, and they also naturally contain different carbon levels. These two were the same. This one happened to be 36%. So again, different biosolids, different sources that comprise the biosolids, therefore different characteristics of the biosolids. And here's just very quickly visually rating these things that Mike did periodically. Well, right out of the gate, the urea jumps to the top of the scales. And it follows all the up and downs of the particular climate that time. When it's getting hot and dry, and this is tall fescue, and it shuts down, then it cools off and it rains. So you see basically the same patterns, but year one, as you might guess, synthetic fertilizer is definitely giving us by far the highest visual quality. And all of the organic treatments with all the biosolids, they're just kind of hanging out. They're always behind that. But as quickly as year 2, the patterns very quickly shift. And now the lowest rated visual quality plots are the urea. And the one that consistently moves up to the top and pretty much stays there throughout is that Spotsylvania compost material. And you'll watch that light green line. And you'll also see Dr. Vanilo's and Dr. Badsmarowski's personal blend, which they made on the basis of supplying nitrogen, will also tend to hang out near the top. And those two treatments pretty consistently across the years from 2014 to 2018, it really starts to distinguish itself, and you start to see the long range goal of applying these materials, which is what we hope will happen, is that essentially we start to feed this soil, feed this turf by these applications of these types of products. And those trends basically stayed in place from 2014 through 2018. Now, what did not work for us, at least in terms of what we had hypothesized, was the ability of these treatments to maintain color under drought conditions. So here's your irrigated plots along the bottom, and here's our non-irrigated plots here, and these all received the same amounts of those materials. We had anticipated with the volumes that were being applied that surely to goodness, this would keep these plants from going dormant. But lo and behold, in this particular trial, and this was the pattern for all those treatments, nothing really ever stood out. But what you do see are definite visual differences here in these products. And this particular image was taken during a drought in 2017. So that surprised us. Our anticipation had been, oh, surely to goodness, we hold better color. We just never really picked that up. And again, don't really know why, except to say that that wasn't the ultimate reason, or at least it wasn't strong enough in terms of moisture holding capacity to keep these grasses actively growing when they were placed under that type of drought. So a couple last slides to show you what would happen to the total organic matter, the carbon in the soil. Well, right out of the gate, the Spotsylvania treatment was a little bit higher. Anything with a different letter is significantly different. But look at what's already happened. We started at 0.3%. And after the first year of 2014, even the urea treated plot is already up to about 0.85, as I recall what that number is. So just by returning clippings, you start to build up organic matter. But of course, the rest of these treatments, we're putting quite a bit of organic in play. And so we're seeing that pattern continue across the years. Again, Spotsylvania and Dr. Ivanilo's own mixture treatment here of a possible one that he recommended to that group about you could use this. You'll keep seeing that one pop up at the top. And those two treatments consistently are working all the way through that 2017 rating period. So now we're up to 3.5% organic matter in that Spotsylvania composted biosolids treatment. And again, we're reaching levels. I tell people when I see things go up to 5%, I'm feeling really good about, we can use that organic matter. What I want you to be careful with though, at some point, can you do too much of a good thing? And the answer is yes. I had a report that came in, it's been a couple of years ago now, but they were 10% organic matter. And I asked them, so how's the yard looking? He goes, well, that's why we took a sample, because it's failing. And I'm like, they've reached that point where those are the type of levels that we start to see in swampy territory that have no oxygen and organic matter can't decompose. So I feel really good about where we've gone from 0.3 to 3.5 and 3 here. All these treatments gave us response. But what we've done here is we've improved the soil health. And we picked up these differences even in the soil bulk density values. A typical clay soil, according to NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service, is you'd like it to be less than 1.1 grams per cubic centimeter. Okay, remember these were tilled plots, but here 3 years into the trial, we're back pretty close and even above that in both these cases of 1.1. So these bulk densities are a little higher than we'd like. This is 0 to 2 inches. This is 3 to 4 inches deep. But look at all the compost treatments and what went on with the bulk density. So we have got bulk densities here which are much more amenable to root penetration, to earthworm migration, etc. So again, overall, we have improved the soil health. And there is one of the final pictures. And again, this was from 2018, and still we're not seeing those responses in those dry down plots where we turned the irrigation off. So the compost was not able to keep us out of a dormancy phase during extreme drought, but it certainly did improve the quality and overall improve the soil in that site. And finishing up tonight, a few thoughts here for you. Drought is natural for grasses. And when grasses go under drought, that's what they're supposed to do. That's where these things evolve. So what do you do if you don't have irrigation enter a drought? The answer is nothing. Leave it alone. Stay off of it. Don't mow it. Put as little traffic on it as you possibly can. I use this slide in my Master Gardener volunteer training. Some of you might say, I think I've seen that before. Well, you would have seen it over and over again. This was from my yard, see, back in 2010, July 28th. If you notice carefully, depending on how big your screen is to see, this grass is starting to turn bluish gray. And in my world, when you see turf starting to go off color and turning bluish gray, that's when it gets scary, because that tells me that those tissues are starting to die. And I had to make a decision about, was I going to drag the hose out and start watering this? Because this is Kentucky bluegrass, and bluegrass is supposed to go dormant, but it's not supposed to turn bluish gray, which tells me there's more than just dormancy going on. Fortunately, that night, we got about a ½ inch of rainfall, and within 1 week's time, the majority of this turf had recovered. But what didn't recover, and you can even tell right here that something has been digging, is where the grubs had paid me a visit. And remember, that's one of your challenges with Kentucky bluegrass is I put it in a moment of vanity. I'm from Kentucky. I'm going to grow Kentucky bluegrass. I got a PhD. I know what I'm doing. What a mistake that was from the standpoint of my maintenance and what I needed to keep that lawn. I very quickly went back to tall fescue when we built house number 3. And those of you who heard me speak know we build houses for sport around here between my wife and I, because we built houses for the stages of where our kids were, and our kids are now gone. So we've definitely downsized, and I've got a nice tall fescue lawn now. And here is my final comments about bluegrass. But I want you to see some really cool genetic differences from a group called the Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance, which sponsored this research for us. We did bluegrass in Blacksburg. Dr. Durr did tall fescue in Virginia Beach. What we do is we put up a rainout shelter. So this is basically a really large carport with super thick plastic on it to keep the moisture out but let light through. And this picture was taken 2 weeks after we initiated the dry down. And what we're evaluating using infrared photography, cameras, et cetera, is how fast do these grasses enter dormancy, and then how fast do they return to green turf. So at 2 weeks, some of these things are already very quickly saying, I'm out of here, I'm shutting down, I'm going in survival mode. And others are hardly showing any signs of stress at all, like endurance and mallard. We're going to see them throughout because these are 2 that are on the list that TWCA TWACA has. Now, the point when it gets scary for us is here. At some point, grass has got to have water. Okay, so here's the endurance and here's mallard. And we're like in here, we walked around. It's like the grass is footprinting. It's not recovering. I'm like, Whitney, I ask you, our Turfgrass program manager, I'm like, Whitney, I'm scared. I think we need to water because the intent is to dry them down, but to not kill them. So 7 weeks after the complete dry down, we turned the water on. We basically saturated the soil and we started to restore them. And look at the difference in the recovery there within 4 weeks time. And some of these plots look as good as new. Again, endurance, mallard, this experimental AKB 2404 look good in all of its replicates. What I want you to know is that, again, these bluegrass people that are breeding these grasses, they want to re-enter this cool season market in a bigger way. And they know the way they get into this market again is develop grasses that have less disease pressure, germinate faster, don't grow as fast, and have great drought tolerance. So they are going to reestablish somewhat of a foothold in the coming years. And I think we're going to see that pendulum go from me being able to actually have something to talk about with Kentucky bluegrass becoming a more popular lawn turf that isn't quite so high maintenance. So there's the website, twca.org. And why I want you to be aware of it is, yeah, they'll have our bluegrass listings up there, but they'll have listings of the most water use efficient turf grasses, period, because every grass that we grow in Virginia has been evaluated somewhere under these types of conditions. So you want to see which fine fescues, tall fescues, Bermuda, Zoysias, ryegrasses, all those grasses are listed. And if it's on their list, they've been verified in the field to be a water conservation turf grass. All right, my summary slide for you. Performance and persistence as low input grasses. What are your things to think about? raise those cutting heights, but raise them prior to your periods of environmental stress. So that's, again, is that low input? Well, I don't know if it is or isn't, but that's the first thing that comes to mind that I see mistakes being made over and over again, is give the grass a chance outside of its best periods of adaptation. So for warm season grasses, raise them prior to killing frost, and cool season grasses, start raising them up in May and get them on the taller side before the stress of mid-June through mid-August arrives. Keep your fertility levels low on all these grasses. Everything that we talked about that I said was lower input, tall fescue, zoysia, fine fescue, most all of them are going to be only in that 1 to 2 range. In fine fescue and zoysia grass, in my mind, 1 pound per thousand is plenty, and apply that grass for cool season grass, apply that in the fall. Irrigation, only irrigate if you're committed to irrigate. Otherwise, let the grasses go dormant, and keep your realistic expectations in place, because you all know as well as I do, I don't have all the answers because they are not possible. You reside in the transition zone. And so good luck, because you're going to need it. If you do the Twitter thing, I only use my Twitter account for extension-based outreach on turfgrass stuff. Same thing for my colleagues. My Twitter handle is @VA-Turf. Dr. Dan Sandors is @VT Turfgrass. Askew has one, et cetera. You see all of us on there, but that's how we use Twitter. And on Facebook, I've become more of a Twitter person than Facebook, not for any particular reason. I just, Twitter is so much easier for me to do with my smart device and my phone. But if you do it and you want to see what we're talking about in the state, I'll certainly let you know. I think that's last slide. Yeah, pretty slide of that. What I'm going to do is go back to that one so we can talk about that citation. I'm sorry if you're going to having eye strain here, watching me flip back. That should be coming up here. Well, it's all the way back to the start. And if there's any questions, I see a few have come in. Can that one be seen as is? And if not, I'll call it out for you. But the main thing you would need to find that citation is to search for Hort Technology, volume 20, pages 418 to 426. And the author is Caceres, Caceres, 2010. And I can't remember, I met Miss Caceres, and for the life of me, I can't think of what her first name was. But young lady from Purdue did this research. All right, I will check.
I can read the questions.
Please do, Natalie.
Can you lay compost in the spring?
Absolutely. I think you could probably lay compost basically any time of year except under conditions, like I said, if you're under extreme drought, I would stay off the grass then, but no limiting factors that I see pretty much any other time of year with the application.
Janine asks, is pure wood ash, no dyes or glues, just as good as lime for soil?
Oh, good question, but it really depends on those. Wood ashes are also highly variable in terms of pH and even their potash levels. A lot of people use wood ash for potassium. So it's somewhat of a moving target question. I would say it's not as good, although good is too strong because, again, it's that old classic, it depends. It has value, but it's one of those you'd be guessing in terms of what is it actually going to do to pH. And some of those materials can have such high alkalinity that the last thing you want to do is to get your pHs above levels, because it's much easier to raise pH than it is to lower pH when you start trying to work with elemental sulfur and other sulfur containing compounds. So it's a question I'm afraid I don't have a perfect answer for you, but I do think there's some risk with just saying it is comparable or better than.
Jeannie asks, I have read about fescue seeds that have been inoculated with endophytes. Any thoughts?
Yeah, if we saw really strong evidence this year, and it's not that that's new, about endophyte actually being quite effective with those armyworm populations. And Dr. Kevin Mathias used to be the He was an entomologist, and he led the 2-year program for turfgrass at University of Maryland. And Kevin now lives basically kind of the border of central and northern Virginia. And he does a lot of consulting work now. And he sent me a really nice report that he wrote this year from his observations about tall fescue that happened to have endophyte in it, and how the armyworms steered clear of that at a sod farm that he consults with. But here's the challenge. It used to be that we touted that, oh, buy endophyte enhanced seed, and they actually marketed it that way. The challenge is they learned that the endophyte is not, it's not persistent season after season after season, at least like they thought it was. So most of the seed companies told me that, because I asked that question about why don't y'all promote more endophyte enhanced turfgrass seed, things that we don't want for your grazing animals because they can cause health issues in grazing animals, but in turf, it's a great natural way of discouraging pests. And all the seed breeders told me that it's just not consistent enough that they want to put their name behind endophyte enhanced turfgrass. And again, that is a change from where we were 15, 20 years ago when I saw that as a selling point. But it's a great idea. It is absolutely gospel truth. It's just that it is not predictable either long-term or from what you have in the seed to begin with. And that's why they really don't talk about it that much anymore, because they can't make guarantees.
Grant asks, which is the best compost we can buy, wood chips, manure, or leaf?
Yeah, if it's compost, and what I would ask for on compost is, can they show you the specs to make comparisons? Because anything that is composted that you really know what you're getting, it's going to be certified by the Composting Council of America. So this is another one of those, kind of like with the wood ash question. I wouldn't tell you that it has no value, but if you're just getting material that somebody claims to be selling, this is compost, I'm kind of like, well, what is it? Some of the compost sources that we get, as you saw in those composted biosolids, they're all over the place. I had a material here recently that was sent to me, and Dr. Vanilo sent the specs, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio was where Greg said he wanted it, but the pH was 8.7. And you can imagine what you get into with applying very much of that on a regular basis. And he said, the only way I know that is because that compost had been tested. So just be cautious. I really don't have a favorite to say you should use this. If you work with a larger composter, then you kind of know what you're getting. If you're working with composted biosolids from different sewage treatment facilities, you kind of know what you're getting. Milorganite is I'd call that essentially I think of it as a fertilizer, but it basically is a composted biosolid. And again, that's another case of you know what you're getting. But our other materials, yeah, I'm a little leery to say do this, because if it truly doesn't have a label of analysis with it, it's somewhat of a crapshoot in terms of guessing about what you're getting.
This is my question. Can you speak a little bit to the 1/3 rule? Because I don't cut grass, I just watch my dad do it, but how do you know, like, do you just bust out a ruler and see like how much you've taken off, or like is there a setting on lawnmowers?
Yeah, literally the rulers back in the day, and I've still got a bunch of them around here, some of the Master Gardener chapters actually would hand out little wooden rulers to go out and measure grass height and see where it's at and see what your mower does there. And then basically, if my goal was to cut it at 3 inches as my maintenance height, then when I cut it, I make sure I take it down to no less than 2 inches. And next time it needs to be cut when it reaches 3. Most people kind of develop a feel for what they want. Again, unfortunately, most of our mowers, realistically, you can't get them to 3 inches unless you install wider, bigger wheels on them for what they're doing. But our goal is to prevent those plants from going into literally what for the plants is a form of shock, because if you remove too much of the leaf surface, you shut down the photosynthetic rates, and the shoots are going to take precedence over the roots when you scalp the turf, and you basically will suppress root development for weeks on end as that plant tries to restore its photosynthetic capacity. And that's why we preach so much. Some of the earliest research in mowing went back to you're pretty good shape if you don't take off more than a third of the leaf blade at any event, in terms of the shock is not something that plant can't overcome. And that's where that rule of thumb comes from.
Okay. When is the best time to get rid of nutsedge?
As soon as you see it, which will be usually about midsummer, when the heat arrives in full force, and then the nutsedge just starts to grow twice as fast as your turf, especially if you have cool season turf, and nutsedge will tower over your cool season turf literally overnight. It will grow a half an inch to an inch a day in terms of setting up its leaves, because that is its environment, and it's further favored by moist conditions. But it'll show up in any lawn, but you'll notice it mostly wet areas, and when it gets very hot, and all of a sudden nutsedge and a very closely related plant called Kalinga, they will show up, and they show up in mass. And unfortunately, nutsedge is one of those plants that everyone's looking for a biological or organic treatment. And you can go out there and pull that stuff to your heart's content, but you're leaving so many nutlets and tubers in the soil that you're going to be very frustrated that you spent all that time. So if you've got very small patches, you can work on those by hand pulling, but pull on days when the soil is plenty moist, and be very patient and work the entire plant up, because it's a tuberous plant. And if you snap those nutlets off, then next year's crop, it's going to return in force. And we've got several really good products out there with a great deal of safety on both cool and warm season grasses that specifically target nutsedge. One of the oldest ones is, brain freeze here, halosulfuron, which is sold under the trade name now of Sedgehammer. And it's been out there for years, and it's a very good, doesn't affect the grasses, but a very broad spectrum sedge and Kalinga product. But there are others, and you can use the pest management guide to find other options.
One last question. Did you say that Milorganite is a type of compost or fertilizer?
It gets described both ways. A lot of people will call it more as I think of it more as a fertilizer, because it is higher analysis than most of our traditional compost materials. Most Milorganite products are 6% nitrogen by weight, 2% phosphorus. Most of our true compost materials are in the range of somewhere between 2 to 3%, but it's a potato argument, because Milorganite is composted biosolids from the city of Milwaukee. They were one of the first cities to be so progressive in figuring out how they were going to handle all their biosolids. And so they started developing a fertilizer about 50, 60 years ago. And so same things like up in your all's area, the one I'm most familiar with, composted biosolids that people in Loudoun County had access to, was Tuscarora Gold comes to mind. And I might be totally off base because it's been a few years, but that's the one I think of. And I remember back in the day, if you lived in Loudoun, you could come over and pick up Tuscarora Gold for free. And people thought they were getting something really good, but then they also realized it's a very distinct smell with all of those materials, because you'll know it when you apply it.
The last question is it helpful to put down ironite?
It's not going to hurt. My take-home message about ironite is do not anticipate to see much of a response unless your iron levels for some reason are just crazy low, which in most of our native soils, I've never seen that. Matter of fact, our issues typically go that pHs become too acidic and we have too much iron and aluminum available, and we have their toxicity forms. So my impression is 99 times out of 100, I honestly doubt that you're going to see a visible response from applying it as a granule. If you apply it as a foliar, I almost guarantee you're going to see a response from those foliar iron treatments, because what you're seeing there is not necessarily a greening from production of chlorophyll, which iron is a a precursor to chlorophyll. It's not the central atom of chlorophyll, which a lot of people think it is, but it helps make chlorophyll. You'll get a response to foliar applications because the iron literally oxidizes on the leaf surface. So think about it, that actually is rusting and darkening the leaf surface. And you'll see that almost immediately. So you might prove me wrong, but only grass plant I've ever seen a response to ironite as a granule was centipede grass. And centipede grass definitely is a unique grass in that it responds to iron applications. But any other grass, I've never really been able to pick up a visible, significant ironite response. It's a legit product. It's not snake oil. I just don't see most of our soils. If you had a sand-based system deficient in iron, I think you would pick up a response. But a native soil, if you keep your pH where it is, it's got plenty of iron naturally available to those plants.
This question, when to apply, I think it's sedge hammer they meant.
Yeah, that would be if somebody's going after the sedges. Again, once you see those sedges, so once they are actively growing, and there won't be any surprise about, remember the way you identify sedges have edges. So all those plants are triangular shaped, and you can either see it by looking down at them. They'll even form almost a triangular shape as a clump, or their stems, you can roll them between your finger and you will feel the the three distinct sides of that triangle. So once they start to rapidly show up in your lawn, that would be the time that you want to make that application. And typically once sedge starts to coming up, all sedge starts to come up. So usually in your all's area, I would think most of the time that's happening late July, early August, during some of the hottest days of the year. And it almost always gets prolific right behind some type of a major storm event where a lot of water gets dropped. And that seems to be the release factor where the sedges go. And what you want to do is apply those products, then don't mow, follow the label, but the label will tell you don't mow typically 24 to 48 hours because you need to have those products translocate to all those below ground plant parts to get as many of those as possible, because as good as the chemistry is, it won't get every single one of them, but you will eventually get them under control if you stay after it.
That was the last question in the chat box.
Awesome. Well, my pleasure to talk to you all. Natalie, I appreciate the flexibility and letting me get back home to do this. Maybe we get back in persons in the future, but I'm better looking by video and in person anyway, so you didn't have to stare at me up and close and personal.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
If you're interested in getting your lawn in shape this spring, why not consider our Best Lawns program? This involves having a master gardener come out to measure, sample, and evaluate your lawn. When the soil test results come back, you'll get a customized nutrient plan along with control recommendations as needed. If you're interested, contact Natalie Walker at nwalker@pwcgov.org. If you enjoyed this video, please contact us at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Let us know about your comments, your suggestions for other videos and classes.